Okay, morning everybody. I think we're going to get started. We've got everybody on the line that we need. Thank you so much for joining today for the second part of our Attribution webinar mini-series. Can everybody just confirm that they can hear me and that they can see the screen, other than Ritesh, who I know is having some problems? Thanks, Annie. Great. Cool. Fantastic. Okay, fantastic. So let's get going then. So today we are lucky to have Matt Ripley with us, who some of you know from having worked on some of our programs, as well as Thabani, who is the MRM manager for our business environment reform program in Zimbabwe. And we also have Ritesh, who is working with the SOBER program, and will be helping us out a little bit on some of the attribution case studies that we'll be looking at. So the agenda for today, quick housekeeping issues around the MRM expert group, and then we'll jump straight into Thabani's case study, where he'll explain to us a little bit about Zimbisa, as well as around a specific example that he and the rest of the Zimbisa team have had some challenges with. We'll then get some feedback and advice from Ritesh and Matt, followed by a question and answer session where people will open up the forum for people to comment on the case study from Zimbisa, as well as to ask their own attribution questions to the wider group. And then Matt's going to wrap up for us with a couple of tips and tricks to take away. So there's not very much from the MRM experts admin side, but 2 points. The first is that the Measuring Systemic Change webinar that had to be rescheduled has been rescheduled for the 31st of August. I will send round a calendar invite soon. I want to apologize to everybody once again that we had technical difficulties that day, but we have Meso partner and Leanne ready to present again, and I'm sure it'll be a really interesting discussion. The second point is around the training that Hans Posthumus is providing in August. Those of you who were online with us last week will have had a presentation from him. He is running training for both project managers and MRM practitioners in August, and the training always gets fantastic feedback. So if you are interested in that training, please do just get in touch and we can try and link you up there. Other than that, not much to say. So Thabani, I'm happy to hand over to you if you're ready to go.
Sure, I'm ready to go. Can everybody hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you loud and clear.
Okay, thank you very much for the opportunity, Molly. And I'd like to greet everyone from the very cold Harare. Just grappling with a bit of a cough, so I'll be coughing here and there while I'm presenting. Please bear with me. Yes, just a brief description of Zimbabwe. Well, Zimbabwe is a small country. It's a total population of about 14 million. 14 million people, which is, as you can see, if it's 14 million people, which means it's centralized. It's actually a centralized economy where everything happens within one center, which is one city, which is Harare. If I could just go on to describe the program. The Zimbisa program is a DFID-funded project of approximately £3.5 million. It was meant to be a 3-year project, and it's the current cycle is coming to an end this December 2016. So you notice this is a short period of time. It's like two years and 2 years and what, 7, 8 months. So it's not exactly 3 years. Yeah. So the Zimbisa project is actually meant to support to improve the business enabling environment in Zimbabwe. When you're looking at the pro-poor businesses, which is our micro enterprises. So actually, its main aim is to strengthen the dialogue capacity of both public and private sector, using supporting functions of media and research to promote inclusive evidence-based policymaking and implementation. Like I said earlier on, Zimbabwe is a centralized country. So if you really have to work in a business environment, in a business environment, you need to tackle things at a national level. So Zimbisa actually operates at national level. There are no countries. It's a bit different from Enable. For those of you who've got an idea of how Enable operates, Zimbisa doesn't operate as Enable because in Nigeria we've got states, but Zimbabwe we don't have states. We actually have provinces, 10 provinces that are governed from one center of power. So you have to work nationally if you really need to work towards changing policies and regulations because it's a centralized economy. I hope people understand what I mean by centralized economy. That's what I'm trying to explain right now. Right, before I move on to the next slide, anyone who has a question about Zimbabwe or the business environment reform in Zimbabwe? Okay, great. If no one has a question, I guess you've understood the little that I've said about Zimbabwe. You can move over to the next slide. Right, the next slide tries to depict the theory of change of the Zimbisa project. So if you notice at impact level, we're aiming to improve the business environment in Zimbabwe and reduce the risk of investing in Zimbabwe and reduce the cost of doing business in Zimbabwe. So that's our aim. That's our overall target to really try and do this. Like I said, this project's been running for 2 years and some 8 months, which I think is too short a time to achieve this. So I'll go further to outline our outcomes. At outcome level, we're looking at having changes in policies, like developing pro-growth policies, also implementing policies that are derived from consultation and evidence. So I'll go on to talk about the challenges that Zimbisa is trying to address later, but maybe let me just try and emphasize that Zimbisa works in 4 intervention areas. These are actually not sectors, but they're actually intervention areas because Zimbisa works in the business environment space. We don't have targeted sectors like maybe manufacturing sector, etc. All we work on is to work on opportunities to improve the overall business environment. So if you look at the theory of change that is depicted there, at the intervention level, we've got 4 boxes down there, colored in blue. So the first one, the first area of focus is the MDAs, which is ministries, departments, and agencies. Overall, we're looking at the government side. So Zimbisa works with the government of Zimbabwe, which is the different ministries, different departments, different agencies at government level. And then the second box, the second blue box at the bottom, also tries to summarize the activities that we're doing with the private sector. So Zimbisa is trying to foster dialogue between private and public sector, which is government and private sector. So in the second part, we are working to strengthen the BMOs, which is the business membership organizations. We're working with quite a number of business membership organizations in Zimbabwe, which are trying to dialogue with the government. And then the last 2 boxes, the third one talks about the media. We work with the media. The media is supposed to provide a platform for dialogue, a platform to make noise. I mean, this is a platform which should be open for government, open for private sector, open for everyone, including the general population, so that they may have a say in terms of the discussions and consultations that are happening to develop proper policies. And then the final part, the fourth blue, the last fourth. That one looks at, we're working closely with research institutions. So research institutions are also providing supporting function to the dialogue, which is providing research to government, providing research also to business membership organizations. You know, for these guys to engage each other, they both need evidence, they both need research, they both need to have a backing of evidence to really, for government to really consider a policy. It needs to be backed by serious evidence and examples from other countries. And for PMOs, which is the private sector, to really engage government as well, they need to have well-researched policy positions and papers. So they definitely need the research. So Zimbisa is working to strengthen these 4 intervention areas, which is MDA's government, private sector, which is PMOs, media, and then the research institutions. So those are the 4 intervention areas which Zimbisa strives to work on to strengthen this. Okay, the slide before. Okay, yes, as you can see this, I've tried to explain this. So, which is number 4, the A, the legislative. This is where we're looking at working through consultation to try and work towards changing, making reforms around the business environment, looking at the legislative roles and the non-legislative roles, policies to make sure that these are aligned to the poor, and they've got the voices of the poor, they've also got the voices of the private sector. And then B, the business membership organizations, I've already talked about this, strengthening them to do research and really advocate and take issues, real issues to government, rather than representing the apex bodies. Next slide. Yes, then like I said, the media and the research, these are the supporting functions of the dialogue. So these are actually supposed to make sure that for media, make sure that there's involvement of the general population. I mean, everyone has access to radio, everyone has access to newspapers. So Zimbisa is currently working with about 6 partners in the print and the radio to try and get them to do projects that are involved in the business environment and provide a platform for discussion of policy issues. And then the research, strengthening the current research institutions, because we've got some government research institutions and private research institutions. So Zimbisa is working with both private and government research institutions to strengthen them to do BE research and provide research for dialogue to ensure that pro-growth policies are made. Thank you. Can move on. Next slide. Right. Assuming that everybody has an idea of what I was explaining earlier on, now what happens here, I'm just going to talk in general about what happens at policy level. So I'm going to talk about one of the interventions where we support MDAs to conduct good consultation practices. So we worked with government with the government platform, it's called the National Economic Consultative Forum, which was formed to convene dialogue in Zimbabwe between private and public sector. So Zimbisa worked with this NECF to strengthen it and to regain its position to convene dialogue within Zimbabwe. This is national dialogues. So it's a national platform for private sector and government. So we have held quite a number of dialogues because we assisted NECF to come up with a public consultation manual, which is a manual to depict the steps which need to be undertaken to conduct a dialogue. So quite a number of government ministries and PMOs have been taken through this. So in particular, the intervention is actually designed to tackle issues of lack of consultation. Because Zimbabwe, what has been happening in Zimbabwe previously during the scoping study, what we found out was that there had been no consultation at all from government. The government has been coming up with policies and imposing them on people. So at the end, PMOs BMOs been afraid to approach government because government felt challenged and threatened. So BMOs have been in the past immediately dismissed as agents of regime change, if I'm to use the exact words which is used by our ruling party. So one needs to be careful in terms of which of these BMOs you work with. So there hasn't been like a proper consultation between these because government, when a BMO would approach government will see them as opposition, quickly dismiss them as opposition, just because also the BMOs had lost the ethics of engagement. BMOs would approach government with unprepared policy briefs, poor research. So right now, what we've currently done is to encourage these guys to really come up with proper concrete research. So government also comes with research and BMOs also comes with research. So the particular, so what happens is there's been lack of involvement of key stakeholders in policy making, and which means that all the policies have been were being imposed to these people, and which is why there's been a degeneration of, the economy in Zimbabwe has been falling, and it's been falling for quite a while. It's because of the policies which are not consulted and stuff like that. So maybe you can move to the next slide where I can try and show the results change for the particular intervention. Yes. So the slide there tries to depict what happens at the consultation. This is one of our intervention areas where we talk about the development of the consultation manual. I've already discussed how we came up with the consultation manual. So what's supposed to happen here is BMO and government would meet, being convened by the NECF, and then discussions will happen here. And then after the consultation process, NECF will track all the recommendations that comes out of the consultation, and then what's expected is to have new or amended policies later after the consultation event, which is supposed to impact on the micro enterprises there. So maybe to give the feel of exactly the intervention that I'm talking about, what exactly happened is NECF convened a dialogue on the 9th of March 2015. This dialogue was meant to discuss issues around the fuel pricing. What happened in Zimbabwe was that the fuel prices were actually not reflecting the global fuel prices. So there was an outcome from business that fuel in Zimbabwe is too expensive compared to the neighboring countries, South Africa, Botswana, Namibia, and Mozambique. So Zimbabwe actually, because of this high fuel prices, it was making Zimbabwe a very expensive destination for tourists, an expensive place for production of goods and services, because everything is dependent on fuel. So if you remember last year, the global fuel prices went down to as low as about $33 a barrel, I think, $33 to $40 a barrel. But fuel in Zimbabwe was costing $1.41 a liter, which was way too expensive compared to any regional prices. So what happened here was NECF prepared a concept paper on this dialogue, and convened transporters associations, quite a number of BMOs like CZI in the manufacturing sector, and the Ministry of Energy, where the fuel issues fall under. So this was a national consultation event which happened, and the deliberations went on, and there were recommendations to look into the fuel pricing model in Zimbabwe, which is actually calculated by the Zimbabwe Energy Regulatory Authority, which is an arm of the Ministry of Energy. So lucky enough, all these stakeholders were present in the consultation. The Zimbabwe Energy Regulatory Authority CEO was present in the consultation event. The Minister of Energy was present. The Minister of Finance was present. It was quite a big national dialogue. So the recommendations taken away by the ministry and ZERA, which came from the BMOs, was that to relook at the pricing model, because it wasn't taking into account the profits that were being. So which means that the fuel dealers were actually profiteering seriously on this, because the crude oil prices were very, very low. So during that time, I think the dialogue happened in March, and signs towards change started happening around September. That's like March, April, May, June, July, September was about 7 months later. The ZERA, the Zimbabwe Energy Regulatory Authority, hired a consultant from South Africa to come and rework the fuel pricing model to calculate the percentages of profit and all the other issues surrounding it. This was a big success, because the model, when it was reworked, actually now depicted and factored in the global fuel prices, like the fuel price per barrel. It's now factored in, and the fuel prices drastically dropped from $1.41 to about $1.20. Can't remember exactly, but it was $1.20 something a liter. This was a well-welcomed move, and this was announced as well by the Minister of Energy and the Zimbabwe Regulatory Authority. Now, as you can see, what I've just described is that at box 6, if you look at the slide there, that's what happened was at box 6. So there's a new policy there that has happened, and it's been announced by the politician. Like I said, that Zimbabwe is politically charged, so the positions for ministers are political positions. So at the announcement, I mean, there was no attribution to the dialogue as normal, because our politicians would like to be seen as, doing good work, and they forget that consultation also is part of their good work, but they want people to see them as hardworking and hard thinkers. So they wouldn't want to attribute it to any dialogue or to any engagement, but to the wiseness of their thinking. So what happens is, maybe I would want to take you through to the Zimbisa's attribution methodology to this kind of intervention. So what Zimbisa aims to do, if you can move to the next slide, Molly. What Zimbisa aims to do, yes. Right. Maybe we can move to the next, because I've already talked about that. Move to the next as well. Right. This is how Zimbisa, the attribution strategy that is employed by Zimbisa. So what Zimbisa does, we document the dialogue activity. So what happened was we took the concept notes and documented everything in all the process. And we also interviewed the delegates to determine whether this was a good consultation event, and whether this was in line with what the people expect, and also identifying other actors. But in the particular dialogue, there were not, like, since we've just started re-establishing NECF, the non-Zimbisa partners were just observers trying to observe what's happening. So we were at the forefront, so there were no other actors there. So we also went on, this is what we do, so we also went on to match the content of the reform with the content of the dialogue activities, which is exactly what went on. Because remember, there is also a lag time between the dialogue and the reform process. So most of the times, the discussions and the issues die during that dormant time. Because that's like 7 months lag. So for people to really think of the reform and link it back to the dialogue needs to really have kept the discussion alive, maybe on media and stuff like that. But that didn't happen. So what was left was for us to conduct key informant interviews with the government official, because this was announced by the Ministry of Energy and Power Development in Zimbabwe. So, trying to get the interview here was really a big challenge, to get the interview from the minister. If you go to the lower level, I know the ministry is big, there's lower level people, officials at the government level. Those will all refer you to the ministry because they wouldn't want to be seen talking to external people. All the public relations is reserved for the minister. So getting, trying to get comments or an interview with the minister and the CEO of Zera proved very fruitless, because the sentiments that we got were that why do we want to take the credit, yet they are the ministry, they should take the credit for introducing a very good policy that is bound to benefit everyone in the country. So you, Zimbisa, who are you? And I mean, so that's the kind of sentiments that we got. So we could not get the direct, because this interview was meant to seal the deal and really rubber stamp that this was due to the consultation event. And really, all we needed to do was for NECF to take this back to the participants and feed back that due to your discussions, the ministry is, this is what the ministry has said, and thank the delegates that had come, so that consultation becomes something that is valued in Zimbabwe. But that did not happen, and NECF was also disappointed that they couldn't get the interview from the ministry, although NECF itself really attributed this change to the dialogue. So as you can see, there is actually a causal relation to this. Us as Zimbisa can link this right up, can link this policy change to the dialogue. But trying to convince like the public, maybe the private sector, the participants to say that this is what happened, they would also want to see the ministry really valuing the consultation process. But this is the missing link between us and convincing the people of Zimbabwe that dialogue is important, right? And then maybe moving over from, if you refer to the previous slide, from box 6 to 7, our target there was at the top box, the micro enterprises make cumulative savings from policy, regulatory, legislative improvements. So we're looking at a total of 100,000 micro enterprises benefiting from this reform, which is 40,000 female-headed. So since this was a numerical change in terms of the fuel pricing, it was we as Zimbisa, we commissioned a study to look into these micro enterprises to find out how many are dependent on fuel. Like Zimbabwe, there are challenges of electricity. So most micro enterprises, the light manufacturing, and where to choose sectors, light manufacturing, other micro enterprises that use fuel on a daily basis to really determine how many we've impacted on and how much cumulative savings these have made. So we only used mathematical approaches, which is a long mathematical approach to determine this. But I don't think this was a challenge from box 6 to 7. The main challenge was from, the main challenge was to attribute the new policies to the time. Because in box 7, we didn't have much difficulties in calculating the savings and the number of micro enterprises. Well, I think at this marathon speed, I've come to the end of my presentation. Molly, I'd like to hand back to you. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Thabani. That's really interesting and very clear. So thanks so much for that explanation. I guess now we'll sort of open it up to Ritesh and Matt to give a bit of feedback on the case study and some reflections on the challenges that Thabani faces.
That sounds good. Molly, would you like me to go first?
Yeah, that would be brilliant.
Okay. Can you just flip back to the intervention results change? I think that'll be useful to have on the screen. So, Thabani, I think that's a really, really interesting attribution challenge. Because I think a lot of what we talk about when we approach the issue of kind of attribution change in private sector development projects, we talk often about new product or service changes for target groups, and we often look at agriculture, and that has its own particular kind of set of attribution challenges. And I think the policy dialogue and policy change, it presents another basket of really interesting but very, very different challenges. And I think one of the things that we've seen over the past few years is that there's a bit of a danger in the field of this kind of almost blueprint approach to attribution, whereby a lot of discussion, a lot of methods, and a lot of learning has happened around the kind of new product and service and how to use things like quasi-experimental designs and how to kind of rigorously attribute change to that. I think there's been relatively less attention on the very important issue of policy and enabling environment change. So first of all, I think it's really refreshing to see this kind of challenge put forward. And going back to basics, in terms of what the DCD standard actually asks, sometimes just to refresh, when we're talking about the kind of causality of change, we're really asking two things. One is the kind of dead weight, what would have happened anyway. So in your case and your example, it's really saying, well, would the policy change have happened anyway without the consultation process, without Zimbisa? And the second part of it is to say, well, okay, of the change that happened, addition to what happened anyway, how much attribution can we take? How much kind of share of the outcome can we claim? So the kind of dead weight in attribution. And the DCD standard really says, well, you have to make every effort to kind of clarify that cause and effect. It doesn't prescribe necessarily particular methods, and whether you call it attribution or contribution, it's up to you. It's making kind of every reasonable effort within the resources and time frame available to the project. And I think your case brings in a really interesting issue as well in a relatively short implementation period with a very large lag between box 5, the process taking place, and box 6, the new policies and regulations coming into force. So there's a kind of temporal challenge as well. So that's kind of just an initial reflection on kind of why I think this is a very relevant challenge, not just as Zimbisa, but to a wider portfolio of projects and interventions. And what I'd say, as Molly's self-styled attribution doctor, I think it's pretty easy to diagnose the problem. I'm afraid there's no kind of off-the-shelf medicine. But I want to just kind of talk through a couple of ideas that might be useful based on experience of other programs. What you're really saying in terms of the key informant interviews and the difficulty of actually the project being able to get any information out of the government about whether the consultation process played a role or not in shaping that new policy is that you've got a kind of inbuilt bias into that key informant interview. Generally speaking, when you're looking at kind of bias in qualitative research, there's usually kind of 4 types of respondent bias I think just useful to be cognizant of. The first of those is courtesy bias. So when you're, as a project, asking someone about why change happened, that respondent just tells you what they think you want to hear, just because they're being nice. The second of those is social acceptability bias. So the respondent tells you, in effect, what is the prevailing norm, because that's what they think everyone would say in that situation. So it's kind of based on strong social norms, which often happens around kind of health outcomes or things like that. The third one of those is a self-serving bias. So the respondent is actually kind of taking credit when things go well, but when things go badly, they're kind of quick to pass the buck and they'll blame somebody else. So you won't really get the truth. And the fourth one, which I think is the most relevant to your case, is this kind of self-important bias. So respondents, what they'll often do is kind of because they don't have a helicopter view or because of inbuilt political circumstances, will kind of overstate their own role in change. So I think that of those kind of four biases that are often prevalent in things like the informant interviews or focus group discussions, you're facing a kind of real issue with self-importance bias there, with the government stakeholders overstating their own role and kind of underplaying or ignoring the role of the kind of private public consultation process. So what to do about it, I guess, is the challenge. Well, the first thing I'd say is actually being aware of those biases. And those biases actually come about for a number of different reasons. One kind of method or one kind of potential solution I'd like to share with you today is around a methodology called QUIP. I don't know how many of you have heard of this. It's QUIP. It basically stands for Qualitative Impact Protocol. And it was developed by a research team at the University of Bath in the UK. And its original use was kind of in kind of rural development, actually, but it's got and it's taken on a kind of much wider applicability. And QUIP basically is a way of structuring your key informant interviews and or focus group discussions in a way that tries to reduce one of these four biases that I was just talking about. It's based on a kind of overall theory of change approach, so very much like we do in the DCD standard, articulating the results chain, kind of asking has change happened, and then why at each step. And it's in this kind of consideration about who's actually doing the data collection, where it's got a quite an interesting perspective. Now, one of the things we often find is that I think a lot of these biases come about because it's the project asking, or somebody who's already got a stake in the process asking, say in this case, the government why change happened. And there's already kind of political power dynamics at play there. So what QUIP does is try to basically keep a level of independence in data collection, i.e. in actually running those key informant interviews. So they have, in kind of attribution research, they have two roles. So there's a kind of evaluation manager and a researcher. Both of those they recommend as being outside the project or the organization, at least the project, so the implementing project. So you appoint, in effect, an evaluation manager to kind of coordinate the process, who will in turn find an independent researcher, usually from a university or some other kind of, in whatever context, a political body. Now, the kind of the trick with this QUIP method is that the researcher is kept entirely in the blind. So they're not actually told about the project, they're not told about who they're working for, they're not told any details really about the intervention. What they are told about is kind of the outcome, the high level change that's happened. And their job then in kind of running these key informant interviews is in effect to go in blind, to be a little bit more neutral in their engagement with respondents, and to try and kind of unpack those myriad of reasons why change may or may not have happened. And then it's the job of the evaluation manager to kind of look at this raw data and to kind of analyze and synthesize and try and kind of unpack that causality. So by keeping that kind of research role a little bit kind of outside of the project, but also importantly by keeping the researcher in effect in the dark, the idea is that you don't have leading questions, you don't go in with a kind of, our objective is to kind of prove that here in this case that the kind of consultation process led to policy change. The kind of setup of the research is to say, okay, policy change happened, let's find out why. And consultation could be one of the many reasons for that. But the idea is that by taking away, trying to kind of minimize that bias, what we'll actually get is a more kind of safer environment for people to kind of start to articulate the real reasons where they don't kind of feel those loaded kind of biases for self-importance, for self-serving, for social acceptability, or for courtesy bias. So that's one kind of way, one kind of method of actually maybe addressing some of the inbuilt biases in this kind of qualitative research, which you absolutely need to do when you're trying to attribute change, particularly on an issue around policy change. So in effect, it's a different way of asking why is change happening, and projects asking that directly to stakeholders themselves, like the government, as Thabani outlined there, there's oftentimes real difficulty in getting to the truth. So yeah, not a panacea, not a silver bullet, but something that I think would be interesting to see, in this context, whether it would actually work or not.
Brilliant, Matt. That's really helpful, and I think it's an interesting angle on how to overcome some of the biases that sort of attribution interviews can often experience. Ritesh, do you have any further input or reflections on the attribution case that Thabani has presented?
Hello.
Hi, Ritesh.
Hi. I think my experience with anything to do with legislations is like that it takes a lot of time, and then I think this is a very interesting case that Thabani has been working on, and it's good that they have seen the results like within 3-year time. Going back to what Matt was saying, I think like for this kind of interventions, counterfactuals, like what could have happened anyway, it's always a bit difficult to predict that. Like for this case, I'm not sure whether this program already had planned to work on this and try to get the fuel price down, or it came after the idea, like when the world market price for fuel was going down. So, say for example, if the world market price for fuel has gone down drastically, so there's always pressure from private sector on the government to reduce the price. So establishing how much the program has contributed towards this could be a bit difficult, and I think one of the best ways to do that is like proper documentation and regular follow-ups with the ministries. And again, like I think Thabani has highlighted that there is another challenge because you don't get the right people at the right time. So the best option that you could have is maybe to work with the next person that you can and document what are all the findings, all focus group discussions.
Brilliant, thank you, Ritesh. That's really useful. Thabani, do you have any further questions, either for Matt or Ritesh, or for the rest of the group regarding this specific challenge that Zimbisa is facing?
Well, not a question as such, but like a comment. Thanks so much, Ritesh and Matt. Your contributions are quite valuable, and I'll really consider these issues later on. But just to ask, is there any other way that one could document this and attribute the change to the, relating to the specific example of fuel prices that I gave, to really show attribution without doing these interviews with these guys, because sometimes you may not get them? Is there any other way, maybe, that one can do this without soliciting for interviews with these politicians?
Yeah, I can jump in here with a couple of other ideas, Thabani. And I think, again, yeah, none perfect, but there's two other kind of methods that you could use, which are both very well documented on the website Better Evaluation. If you've come across that, it's betterevaluation.org. The first one, although it would traditionally involve lots of kind of stakeholder interviews, is contribution analysis. But in essence, what that does is looks at your results chain that we have on the screen there, but overlays it with an awful lot of assumptions. So what you're trying to do is basically prove not just that the kind of core results chain logic happened, but also that the kind of assumptions, the other actors and factors that might have been contributing to that change actually happened as expected. So the idea is what you're trying to do is continually kind of probe that theory of change, usually through a mix of kind of primary data collection, which would involve key informant interviews, although you don't necessarily have to do them if it's too difficult. But what you're trying to do is construct what they call a contribution narrative. And all you're doing is going back and continually kind of looking at those assumptions and saying, well, you know, did this happen? Did this not happen? So it's looking at the wider environment of how change happens. What you can't get from that process is you're kind of almost quantifiable or kind of tangible attribution. You get a kind of attribution narrative in a way, if that makes sense. So that's kind of one way of building up through contribution analysis that can be very effective. The other one is a methodology known as general elimination methodology. I don't know if you've come across that before, but in essence, it tries to eliminate every other possible explanation for why change happened. So it's a bit like kind of outcome mapping, where you're kind of almost crossing every other alternative explanation off, or until you get to kind of the kind of thing you're looking for, in essence. So again, it's kind of a bit of an upside down way of looking at why change happened, but you're trying again just to isolate a little bit the contribution that you've made here through the consultation process relative to other kind of actors and factors that could have had kind of major influences on that policy change. And these are both what I'd call more theory-based methods. So you do them, again, primarily through a kind of desk review with the option of having things like key informant interviews and focus groups on top. I would say for both of those to work and to be credible, oftentimes what you need is someone external, slightly independent from the program to do it, because obviously you then get a whole other kind of bias from the project itself. Will see change a little bit differently. So kind of usually run by as part of a kind of more independent evaluation, but there's no reason why you couldn't do that yourself, embedded in the standard. So those are kind of two other methods of contribution analysis and general elimination methodology that might help get the sense if those actual key informant interviews are just too difficult or bias loaded to do.
Ritesh, did you have any comments just on Thabani's query around other methodologies, or any sort of final thoughts on the case study?
I think I would agree with Matt. And then if the country's fuel price has been fluctuating with the world market price, like if the world market price goes up, the price goes up. If the price has been going down, like for last 3 to 5 years, if the price has been going down and the country's price is going down, then we can also use trend analysis to see like what would have happened. Like I understand that the price like last year went down really down, and the country wouldn't have lowered the price that much. But and then like if doing this trend analysis and then talking the discussions of key informant interviews with the key stakeholders who are behind changing these fuel prices, I think could be another way to find the conflictual and then find out what is the program's contribution towards the decline in price.
Brilliant, thanks Ritesh, that's fantastic. Thabani, does that answer your question?
Sure. Thank you so much, Matt and Ritesh. Very useful indeed.
Great. So I think, thanks so much, Thabani, for sharing this case study with us. I think the great thing about the Zimbisa example is that it touches on quite a few common challenges that we face when we're trying to work through the attribution of our interventions. Do we have any further questions from other programs that are on the line for either Matt or Ritesh or the wider group? around similar issues that they're having, or potentially any comments that people have for Thabani relating to his specific case. I can always kick off from Mafita has a question for Ritesh and for Matt. They couldn't be online today, but they sent a question through via email. It's quite a broad question, but they were wondering what are the most practical ways to eliminate potential spillover effects when you have to have a control and a treatment group in the same geography. So Mafita is a skills development program. They'll be looking specifically at training young people in certain areas. And I think the struggle that they are facing is that all selection will happen from a pool of candidates that have very similar lifestyle, similar patterns within the same geographic location, and they wanted to know from Ritesh and Matt and Thabani what practical ways you would suggest they could look into for eliminating spillover effects.
Sorry, it's just taking me a while to mute there. I'm happy to follow up on that one. I think it's a really interesting question. Because in effect, I'd say, just to clarify more, is Mafita a kind of market systems project or more kind of traditional skills development?
It's a market systems project.
Okay. I think this gets to a really interesting issue in measuring attribution in a market systems project, because on the one hand you have this tension between an intervention logic that really wants spillover effect, right? That's the whole point of a program, is to get large-scale change, and for that you need kind of copying and crowding it. So in effect, on the one hand, the kind of intervention teams see spillover as great, but then the MRM teams kind of don't want spillover because, like in the Zimbisa example, it actually kind of ruins good research. So there's this really fascinating tension sometimes at the heart of an MLP program between the kind of core intervention logic and how to set up that research design. What I suggest and what the experience has been in terms of kind of bridging that gap is that, well, actually, the spillover is the reality. I think that will always happen, in whether it's a kind of skills project or kind of an ag program looking to get a new product out into the market. You often have a lot of what's technical kind of contamination between treatment and control groups when you're trying to construct a kind of with and without research. Now, actually, what I'd say for that, and the best way to deal with it, is probably the best way to deal with a lot of research, whether you're worried about spillover or not. I think if in an M4P program you're trying to rigorously evaluate the impact of a pilot, and you're trying to get to kind of attributable change, you can often spend quite a lot of time doing a very clean baseline, as close as possible to the kind of point of sale or product or service kind of uptake. Obviously wait for that to be used and then go back and do your end line afterwards. And you do that both for the treatment groups, so the ones who are receiving the product and service, and for a control group who, in theory, are meant to be totally unaffected by the intervention. Now, obviously, it's in theory, because what happens a lot of the time is that these are kind of open market product and services, so you can't control who get treatment or control groups. But actually, another problem is that you do baselines before you know whether an intervention is actually even going to work or not. So when you're running a large program with lots of interventions, with lots of kind of before and afters, the danger is that you do a lot of baselines for interventions that end up generating very little impact whatsoever. And that can become quite a time kind of burden and cost burden. Now, what I'm not saying is that we shouldn't do baselines whatsoever, but I think what's important is the timing of those, and maybe compromising a little bit on introducing an element of recall bias and saying, well, if you don't know who's actually going to be in the treatment group, who actually is going to be in the control group, and we don't know whether this intervention is going to work, so it's not worth doing something very early on. Let's see how it runs over the next year. You then basically squash your baseline and end line at the same time and introduce a kind of combined end line. That obviously has recall bias in there, but what it does do is allow you then to assign who would be treatment and control at one point of time later in the intervention. So what you're not doing is kind of ex ante, or before the intervention, assigning treatment and control, but you're waiting to see who's actually up, taking up new products and services, and assigning at one point of time after in the future. The DCD calls this, I believe, a kind of comparison groups when you don't know exactly who's going to be in the treatment or control at the outset of an intervention or even during intervention, but you kind of wait a little bit to assign people to treatment or control. What that can do is, yes, respond to kind of spillover problem that Moyo was mentioning there from Zimbisa, but it can also help to make things a little bit more practical in terms of reducing costs if you have quite a large portfolio of interventions where you want to do good results measurement and attribution. So that's one kind of practical way of dealing with the issue of mechanics.
Brilliant, Matt. That's really, really helpful. Thank you so much. And I will make sure that I pass that message on to Mifita, and I'm sure it's relevant for other programs here as well. Ritesh, did you want to pick up on that, or should we solicit some more questions?
I think we can look at more questions. I would agree with Matt on that.
Okay. So are there any other questions from other programs that we have online today? Anybody else who's working in business environment reforms interventions that want to ask similar questions as those that have been raised around the Zimbisa case, or any other questions at all? Nope. Okay. I think we've caught everybody on a Friday morning, which means, or evening, if in Annie's case. So I think maybe we could.
Hi, Malik.
Yes. Hi, Thabani.
Yes. Sorry. Just something that I forgot to mention. Maybe to find out how important is this. What we did was we recorded a video for the dialogue. So, which was the dialogue, where we interviewed the participants before they went into the dialogue. Video recorded the whole dialogue process, and then recorded everything right to the end. Then, after that, after failing to get the interviews from the government ministries, we also did a pure price turnover dialogue video, where we went back to the participants that participated in the dialogue. So we hired a video recording company, so they went back to the participants that we interviewed before the dialogue to find out what was their feeling and to really think that the dialogues are important and stuff like that. So this was in a way to try and close the gap which was missing for the politicians, like government ministers, to really rubber stamp the dialogue and attribute it to the policy change. Do you think that was useful? Maybe if I can give it back to Matt and Ritesh.
Ritesh, did you catch that that last comment from Thabani?
I'm afraid it cut out for me just at the beginning as well.
Okay, sorry. So Thabani, could you just repeat your question?
Okay, yes. I just wanted to find out the feeling from the group because I forgot to mention this during my presentation that what we did earlier before the dialogue, we did a video recording for the dialogue where we interviewed the delegates before the interview and find out what their expectations are. Then we video recorded the whole process of the dialogue, and then re-interviewed the people after the dialogue. So after the regulatory change, the same video recording company that we had them again to go back to the same participants to find out whether they feel these changes were attributed to the dialogue, whether they feel their contribution was taken into consideration by the government, how they feel about the dialogue process. Do you think this would have closed the gap that I really had of not getting a chance to interview the government minister?
Yes, interesting one. And I think maybe, Molly, going back to the intervention results chain again, Thabani, what you're talking about there seems to be a very kind of innovative way of maybe isolating why change happened between probably kind of boxes 4 and 5 almost, if I'm not mistaken, the kind of output of kind of private sector MDs engaging with each other to the dialogue process itself, but not perhaps to the kind of bigger attribution challenge that you were talking about between kind of boxes 5 and 6. So yeah, definitely helping strengthen that kind of contribution or attribution narrative, but probably not getting around the kind of core challenge of those people who are actually enacting the policies themselves in box 6. Being able to kind of acknowledge the contribution that the inclusive consultation process would actually take. At least that's how I kind of understand it from what you're saying.
I think that was a very innovative way of documenting the intervention activities. But yeah, I would agree with Thabani, with Matt, that the greater challenge would be to actually find out from the government officers or the ministries how much of these contributed towards them revising the fuel prices. And Thabani, I'm not sure where the ministry also involved in those dialogues.
Yes, the minister and his permanent secretaries and officials were there during the dialogue. Yeah.
And then after the price was revised, then you did a video again with those guys, right?
Yes, went back to the same people, but we couldn't get the interviews from the government officials. That's where the challenge was. But the rest of the other participants, we all managed to get some feedback.
Okay, brilliant. So if just to close up, Matt has offered to give us a bit of a recap around some of the key themes that come out from the Zimbisa case study.
Great, yes, and just to recap on some of the kind of tips and tricks that we've touched on today in the webinar, and these kind of fall in 2 baskets. One is on kind of stakeholder perceptions and dealing with bias when you're doing key informant interviews, and the second is on counterfactual. Sorry, there's a bit of feedback.
Oh, that's me.
I'm just going. Okay. Oh, that's better. Yeah. Sorry. Static has gone. And the second basket is on counterfactual research. So really the Mafita question, how to kind of get some pragmatic methods when you're trying to construct control groups. So on the next slide, the first one really is kind of when you're asking stakeholders, right? And the idea from the Zimbisa case is to try and establish cause and effect by assessing those importance of other actors and factors in a change process. Why did the new policy change happen? And doing that against the results chain, really for each box, asking has change happened and why? And oftentimes one of the kind of default methods for doing that is to ask stakeholders themselves, to ask government ministries, ask the private sector about their kind of perception of causality of why change happened. But if we move on to the next slide, the kind of common pitfall with that is that if you as a project are asking a stakeholder about a change that you've helped support, there's often a whole load of kind of bias built into that interview process. So oftentimes what projects do is kind of ask quite closed, quite leading questions that often gets to bias, where change is either completely attributed to the project or, in the Zimbisa case, kind of not at all. And the reasons for that, on the next slide, are these kind of 4 key respondent biases that are really important, I think, just to bear in mind when you're planning how you're going to collect the data in qualitative interviews, and very importantly, who's going to be collecting and the data as well, but who's actually going to be running the interviews. So being aware of that stakeholder bias is really kind of the first step. Is there kind of potential for courtesy bias, where respondents tell you what you want to hear? Is there going to be social acceptability bias because you're dealing with an issue where there's a kind of prevailing norm and people don't want to go against the grain? Is there a self-serving bias where, in this particular culture and context, people will happily take the credit when things go well, but blame everybody else when things go badly? I think that's a very human trait. And what we heard today from the Zimbisa case was the self-importance bias, where in this case the public officials are maybe overstating their own role or own importance or own contribution to events for various reasons. So how can you deal with that? Well, a lot of programs often kind of employ bottom-up strategies. So they kind of go in with kind of asking about program activities. So, okay, there was a consultation process. Minister X, did that lead to you changing your policy dialogue? Well, that often brings out all of those biases we were just talking about and is very leading as well. Methods that I was mentioning, like QUIP, QUIP, the Qualitative Impact Protocol, try and look more at kind of top-down strategies. So they ask about the observed outcomes. They say, okay, the policy has changed, and then they drill back down from that about the many reasons why. And one option for doing that is to try and kind of almost do those key informant interviews, qualitative research, where the researchers are blind. So really, when you're thinking about methods, yes, focus on discussions, key informant interviews, really think about the kind of bias when you're planning that to get more rigorous qualitative research. One technique you can start to do with top-down is funneling. So you start with very open questions. So you start with big picture questions about fuel prices over the decades in Zimbabwe, and over time you narrow in after a series of questions on consultation processes. So you start big and you get narrower over time. Or you can start to ask kind of proxies. Maybe people aren't going to talk about the kind of macroeconomic factors or kind of general trends in fuel price, but they might talk about how much petrol cost the last time they went to kind of fill up their car at the petrol station. So asking slightly tangential questions that can get to the same answer. I think finally, consideration of who measures. Oftentimes, especially with qualitative research, we tend to outsource quite a lot or get in external expertise to do kind of quantitative research, like surveys. But actually, the who and who's doing the qualitative research can matter quite a lot as well. Is it the project? Is it kind of independent third party, like a research organization, NGOs, an association, or another stakeholder themselves? There's no kind of one set answer to that, but to start to think outside of who can support and really help reduce those biases. So that's kind of the first bucket on dealing with stakeholders and key informant interviews when you're attributing change. Moving on to the next bucket, really on the kind of counterfactual research. And we alluded to this a little bit today, although it's not directly so relevant to the Zimbisa cases, is, as Ritesh was saying, you know, what would have happened anyway, the deadweight effect is quite hard in the case of Zimbisa. In effect, to get that estimation of deadweight, you need to come up with some kind of counterfactor. And oftentimes we do this, like with the Mafita question, by conducting kind of surveys to isolate and estimate the kind of extent of change and how much can be attributed to particular activities we've done, and often by comparing treatment and control groups. But I think the common pitfalls for that, like I was saying before, was, well, oftentimes we do quite elaborate research studies, we do quite elaborate, sorry, the next slide, Molly. We do quite elaborate baseline data collection, as close as possible to point of sale or point of access for a new product or service, for interventions that end up generating little or no impact. So I think oftentimes in market systems projects where we're really looking at, you know, the biggest pathway to impact being through not pilots, where we're just trying to do proof of concept to see whether an intervention is worth backing, but actually in the kind of scale up phase. So what I'd say oftentimes measure the wrong thing quite precisely, but have a lot of effort into that attribution of pilots, but actually we kind of fall down a little bit when it comes to scale, because that is more challenging. So 2 decision-making lenses that you can use on the next slide are, in essence, what I call proportionality. First one. Think very carefully about the kind of level of time cost investment that you're placing in counterfactual research, because I think this needs to be kind of relative to the size of impact being generated. Right? So, you know, you can do very sophisticated methods to quasi-experimental designs, even experimental designs, and totally eliminate the spillover effects, the contamination we were talking about earlier, but it can be quite costly and it can be time intensive for oftentimes overworked MRM team anyway. The challenge here is that obviously in a portfolio, if we're doing lots of interventions, we don't really know what's going to succeed and which won't in advance. So how on earth do we know where to put our kind of research resources? One strategy is just to kind of arbitrarily decide beforehand and say, well, we're only going to measure a couple of interventions fairly rigorously and do the rest to a kind of very basic level. And that oftentimes is not the best strategy, and certainly won't score the highest marks on something like a DCD standard audit, because it could turn out that those couple of interventions you decided to back is a bit of a gamble that backfired and they don't actually succeed. So I think the guiding principle too is the kind of pragmatism, just kind of trying at every stage to think, are we kind of taking a pragmatic, practical approach to attributing change, and particularly to constructing or estimating that counterfactual. To try and keep the kind of time cost efforts down by, yes, maintaining statistical rigor, because we still want to make causal inferences, we still want to extrapolate the research we're doing. So you want to make kind of good sample sizes still, but maybe compromising on the length of surveys, thinking about things like mean data collection, using kind of 10, 20 questions for the survey maximum, and timing. And that's what I was talking about earlier in the Mafita example. Being prepared to deal with a bit more recall bias for squashing together your kind of baseline and end line all together and doing that at one point of time, and only at that point of time kind of making the decision about who falls into the treatment and who falls into the control group. And very, very briefly, on the last slide, I won't go into detail now, but I'll put my email on the chat board in case anyone wants to follow up directly. This kind of works from a, you know, there's a difference, I'd say, from a technical best practice in attribution to what's really kind of pragmatically best practice. And this is an example from a project in Zambia. I had a portfolio of interventions, did a great quasi-experimental design before and after survey of treatment control farmers on one contract farming intervention in soy. Spent quite a lot of money on it, got a lot of time investment, but actually the pilot turned out to have a negative net income change. And actually halfway through the pilot, the program changed the business model anyway, changed their kind of terms of engagement with partners, so the whole research was slightly compromised anyway. So this kind of need before after treatment and control wasn't necessarily the best from a pragmatic and learning perspective. And attribution obviously plays a big role in improve, but it can play a very, very important role in kind of improving interventions as they go along. So in the future, what they did was to say, well, okay, we've got kind of 3 interventions ongoing now. We're going to kind of let's just let these things run a bit before we decide what our attribution is going to be. So the first one actually did no research on attribution at all because the intervention failed early on, and regular monitoring against the monitoring plan showed that things weren't working out. Second intervention was a little bit too early to tell, but the MRM team had a kind of combined baseline and end line ready to go as soon as harvest was happening, and the company was activating the buyback clause, and the last intervention was able to do that in a kind of quasi-experimental design, combining again that treatment and control group, but limiting the number of questions we were asking, because by then they had a fairly good idea of what their kind of key research was. But I'm happy to go into that in more detail. But I found that shift in the kind of technical best practice that as MRM teams we often get caught up in, which I think is obviously very important, but that kind of lens of pragmatism as well. And when you're looking at kind of attribution for prove and improve purposes, what might be technically the best method might not be pragmatically the best method for kind of learning and reporting. And that's the slide deck.
Brilliant, Matt. That's really really valuable and very well summarized. I will follow up the webinar with an email which includes these slides. So if anyone has any further questions for Matt on this last point, then they can get in touch that way. I'm cognizant that we are almost running up to an hour and a half, and I know everybody's extremely busy. So I think all that remains is to say a massive thank you to Matt and Ritesh for taking their time to look through the Zimbisa case study and prepare content to share with us today, as well as to say a really big thank you to Thabani for sharing the Zimbisa case study, as well as sharing a bit more around some of the attribution challenges that they're facing there as a team. So a massive thank you to Matt, Ritesh and Thabani, and I will follow up the webinar with a recording as well as the slides and some of the links to some of the points that have been raised during the webinar. So if no one has any further questions, I hope everyone has a lovely Friday and a very pleasant weekend. Okay, thank you everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.